Hi, Benji. Hi, Matthew. Thank you for joining us today at Texans for Natural Gas. As you both know, I'm Elizabeth Caldwell, the spokesperson for Texans for Natural Gas. I really appreciate you both joining. To get started, I think it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about yourselves and your organizations. I don't think all of our supporters are familiar with the American Conservation Coalition, so I would love to hear from both of you about who you are and what organizations you represent.
I'm Benji Backer, president of the American Conservation Coalition, which is the largest right-of-center environmental organization in the country. But we also focus mostly on fighting for market-based limited government reforms to kind of help solve our environmental challenges. And the way that we can do that best is through American innovation and technology and basically doing things that we do best here in the United States. And so we're building a grassroots movement across the country around those values as kind of an alternative to what has been presented by a lot of the environmental community in the past, which is kind of very narrow-minded. You can only do this and you can do that. You have to do this, you have to do that. And saying, no, that's actually not how it has to be. We can fight climate change, we can fight environmental issues, have a great economy at the same time, and still use energy sources that we rely on each and every day. So super excited to have the conversation with you guys and as well with my friend Matthew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Wilcher. I'm the president of the Houston Young Republicans and the national committeeman for the Texas Young Republicans. And Benji reached out to me about being on this conversation, and I'm really glad that he did, because the YRs around the country, but particularly in big cities such as Houston, one of the big things that we're focused on is changing attitudes about what people find important. Because we really believe that values can be timeless, but the issues that we care about and that we talk about can change, and we need to find innovative solutions and be at the forefront of leading the GOP to those new solutions. Oftentimes, political parties can be a bit stagnant. And so one of the things that we really try to do is look for bright young minds such as Benji, who can help us, really articulate a vision for the future about climate and all the other issues that we focus on.
Thanks, Matthew. I know today we really wanted to talk about climate change. I think that's on all of our minds. And something that I wanted to talk about was, I know the American Conservation Coalition, or ACC, you guys proposed a climate plan that was supposed to be a counter to the Green New Deal. Can you tell me a little bit about that plan? And because we are Texans for Natural Gas, what role natural gas has in that plan that you all proposed?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're really excited to have actually the backing of a lot of the national natural gas industry in terms of support, public support of the American Climate Contract, which is our alternative. And really, we just believe that we have to tackle climate change. It is a real threat. It is something that we have to tackle. And it's, no matter if you believe in climate change or not, reducing emissions and providing more inexpensive energy for everyone, they're all good things. So we have to do that. But we also have to keep the economy moving at the same time. And we do need to have inexpensive energy, and we need to be able to help all Americans power their homes and businesses and create more jobs all at the same time. The Green New Deal did not do that. And so I think that's something we all kind of know. And obviously, a state like Texas knows firsthand that would be very detrimental to the state. And so our contract basically outlines the approach to climate change that we think will solve the problem in the long term, which includes a large portion of all of the above energy with a focus on natural gas as a way to reduce emissions. The United States has led the world in reducing emissions over the past decade plus because of the transition to natural gas from a lot of older coal plants. Obviously, clean energy sources like wind and solar and nuclear and hydropower and improvements in fracking and all those different things, they have all helped. And so it's been a really exciting thing to see the United States lead the world in that while still relying heavily on something like natural gas. So it's a huge part of our plan. And actually, one of the bills that we support, actually a couple of the bills that we support on Capitol Hill right now include improvements to nuclear gas, natural gas technology, as well as nuclear improvements to look at different ways to improve the different technologies around those different energy sectors like natural gas and nuclear, because it's energy sources like those that are going to power the future. They have the capacity to power entire communities like they've powered all of Texas. And it's a really exciting opportunity to look at how we compare economic sustainability and environmental sustainability at the exact same time. And in addition to, helping us reduce emissions, natural gas has also helped us create thousands of jobs and across the United States, and it's been an industry that a lot of areas have relied on for basically uplifting people from all walks of life. So we're just really excited to have the American Climate Contract be at the forefront of the policy discussions and supported by so many young people across the country, so many industries across the country, and we're going to keep pursuing it for the decades ahead, and natural gas will be a huge part of that, as well as nuclear gas, of course.
Benji, you bring up something, really interesting is you bring up the energy mix, right? And how the energy mix isn't just going to be one energy source. It's that for us to make an impact and reduce emission and meet our energy demands, we're going to need natural gas, and we're also going to need renewables. And something we think is that natural gas is a complement to renewable energy. Texas is the largest producer of wind energy and also the largest producer of natural gas. A coincidence,
right?
Matthew, I know you're a fellow Houstonian here, which is also known as the energy capital of the world. What have been some of the more exciting developments you've seen around energy and the energy mix?
Well, I think that one of the most interesting developments has been the increased use of carbon capture technology in order to reduce our carbon emissions even further, beyond the cleaner fuels that we're already using. Regarding the energy mix, one of the really interesting things about the law with regard to energy policy here in Texas is that if you build a wind farm, if you build a wind turbine, and it provides 1 megawatt hour of energy, let's just to make the numbers easy. Do you know how much of that is allowed to be considered base load for the state of Texas? Zero. The reason that they're not allowed to consider renewables base load energy sources in Texas is because you can't guarantee that the wind will be blowing. You can't guarantee that the sun will be shining. And since right now, the way that the state can essentially tell a power plant, they can say, okay, if you are guaranteeing that you're going to provide us this much energy, if for some reason one of their power plants is not working or working at lower capacity, the state can come in and say, this is not the agreement that you made with the state, and we're going to fine you, do whatever. You can't really do that with someone who has put up a wind turbine. That's why natural gas is so useful for us here. It's a wonderful, it's a byproduct of so many of the drilling and so on that we've already been doing. And since it doesn't, for a long time, the price tracked so closely with oil, but then it diverged after the dip in 2008. The price of natural gas has remained very cheap in the United States as a provider of energy for major cities and for grids. Can't really do that with oil quite as well. And so this mixture is great because we get to have the benefits of wind and solar, et cetera, when it's available to us. But we have the stability of natural gas and other forms of power supply to our grid.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a much more technical answer than I'd been planning.
No, it was great. I mean, and it's great that you also brought up, affordable natural gas. I think another thing that we talk about a lot is energy poverty, and how we think it's an issue that can get looked a lot, especially when people are talking about, what policies can be implemented. And I think Green New Deal is maybe an example where it's not addressing that energy poverty. And energy poverty, for those that may not know, is it's either A, when you don't have access to reliable electricity, and that can happen a lot in underdeveloped countries, or B, you have an issue where high energy prices primarily affect low income populations, disproportionately affect them. And so when we see, climate plans, for example, that try to fade out natural gas from their energy mix, but don't propose a equally low cost alternative, we have to point out that you're going to really hurt some of those low income folks that they're not going to be able to make up that price difference.
Right. And honestly, I mean, that's one of the biggest flaws of something like the Green New Deal, is because they talk about environmental justice and environmental injustice. And honestly, they're right to say that low income and minority communities are the most affected by environmental problems. That is true. And if you look statistically at it, it is more than true. But at the same time, we also have the realities of that those people can't afford to pay for, double the energy bill that they currently pay. They can hardly pay what they're paying currently. So for a climate plan not to have an alternative and an option for low-income people, it's not actually taking the issue seriously, because it's not feasible. And most importantly, any climate plan that doesn't include something like natural gas, which is a clean way to power our communities, create jobs, and keep prices low, isn't taking the issue seriously, because you're not going to be able to power an entire country off of wind and solar alone, especially in 2020. The technology is getting better, but we're not going to be able to do that. What we can do is have a mixture of wind and solar and other energy sources with an energy source like natural gas, which can power entire communities, keep prices low, and reduce emissions at the same time. And so as people who care about the environment, as I do, but also understand the economic stability angle, we need to have the low income communities at the forefront of this discussion, because if we're harming them, we're harming everything. And any plan that doesn't include natural gas is harming low income communities and not actually taking the problem seriously.
To piggyback on what Benji just said, I mean, just looking at it from an engineering perspective, in order to have the energy purely from renewables for the entire country, we would essentially need to terraform Arizona into one gigantic solar field. Right now, one of the big problems is the lack of ability to transport energy or renewable energy, because we don't have we do have reliable batteries. We don't have any a highly efficient energy transfer method from renewable energy into a storage form, whereas natural gas or more traditional forms of fuel are easily transportable. Natural gas less so than some of the previous forms of energy, but we're getting to the point of being able to I think there are now 4 liquid natural gas plants in the United States, and because of that, we're able to help reduce the stranglehold that Russia has over European energy prices. Eastern European energy prices or natural gas prices are something like 6 times that of the prices in the United States, and that's because there's only one supplier, Russia. And if we're able to help provide some of that energy, help export that to Europe, we'll be able to lower the prices there and provide an exportable commodity here. If you look at the history of energy, it started out the only way for humans to produce energy was through our muscles, and then we started cutting forests and burning down trees, and then someone found this rock in the ground that you can set on fire, and then people found that if you kill all the whales and take their blubber, then you can do something with that. But the downside was that with the black rocks, everyone got black lung. With the whales, you're killing all the whales. Then people started saying, oh, we can find that same stuff in the whales in the ground, but that caused so much pollution. We're now getting to natural gas that has a lot of benefits compared to what we previously had. Does that mean that it's 100% perfect? No, it's probably not, but it's a lot better than where we were just a few years ago. And we need to be looking at that at it from a marginal perspective of what is better than what we had before, not what is perfect, because we can't ever get to perfect.
And no energy source is 100% clean, and that's the reality. I mean, it takes materials that are terrible for the environment to create a solar panel and a wind turbine, and it's harmful for the environment to have nuclear waste. And hydropower can really hurt fish, and obviously you have to build the hydropower dam as well. So I mean, every single energy source has its own problems, and those are just some of them. So the main point is that nothing's going to be 100% clean. Nothing's going to be 100% perfect. And I love that you said that, because it's about incremental changes to improve each energy sector. For an organization like ours, it's saying, okay, how can we improve wind turbines so that they do kill less birds and that they can store energy better? For hydropower, how can we divert salmon away from the dams? And for natural gas, how do we capture the methane and capture some of the other emissions that are still emitted? I mean, those are easy problems to fix over the long term if we look at it from a marginal and incremental perspective, rather than saying, where's the perfect solution? Because if you're demanding a perfect solution, you're not going to get a solution at all. Whereas if you are talking about incremental solutions, you are going to get the desired solution, and maybe it'll be better than you originally thought, or maybe it'll fall a little bit short, but it'll be a lot better than nothing. And so that's kind of the way that we look at it. And I also just love, Lizzie, that you brought up the fact that in Texas, natural gas is thriving and so is wind. Texas isn't the only state that we're seeing that. Across the country, we're seeing like traditionally red or like rural states really embrace wind and solar energy while still having a very vibrant economy in the oil and gas space. And that's because you can work hand in hand between these different energy sectors. And you're seeing progress being made in all of those states, more so than even some of the states like California and New York, which are always heralded as kind of like the enviro states. So I think it's really up to us to reshape the conversation and allow it to be said that, yes, wind energy and natural gas are both awesome sources of energy that can succeed in the same state, in a state like Texas.
So, something that we've all discussed is that we're big supporters of what can be done better, especially what can we do better when it comes to energy and the environment. And like you said, we believe in trouble that a lot of our supporters have. And I think, as a young person, I'm sure some of, both of you have maybe run into this before. How do you have that conversation with friends or acquaintances that really believe in an all or nothing solution? Because I think we all need to be able to have constructive conversations around these issues for people to learn and grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess for me, it's a tough question, right? And there's no silver bullet answer, because if you are talking to somebody who believes that there's an all or nothing approach, it is hard to get out of that. So I think also understanding that going into that conversation is important. But the way that I've looked at it that's really worked, and the way that our team has looked at it, and the way that I think the community at large is starting to look at it, this kind of alternative environmental community, is saying, okay, we need to make progress now. And if a Green New Deal is in our future, or some sort of policies in our future, and you want to believe in fighting for that, fine. But we can't wait for that to happen. So while you're fighting for whatever policy you want, let's focus on some of the changes that can be made now, because anyone can get behind the fact that if you're a Green New Deal hater or a Green New Deal supporter, we need to reduce pollution by the year 2030 or 2025. And the Green New Deal is not feasible in 2020. So if they believe in that all or nothing approach, it's saying, what can we get done right now in 2020 before we get to whatever policy, carbon tax, cap and trade, whatever policy you want to support? If you have an all or nothing policy, how do we get closer to real results, regardless of if that's going to happen? That sort of messaging tends to resonate. And then additionally, I think it's boiling it back down to people who really passionately care about the environment, and they truly want the environment to be improved and emissions to go down. And they're not looking for some sort of socialist, communist agenda. They just really want something to be fixed, and telling them, well, we do need to fix those things, but we also have to take into consideration these low-income communities and people who have jobs, and people who rely on the economy, which is every one of us. And we have to take those into consideration. And that seems to hit home as well, because a lot of the time, those all-or-nothing solutions only take the environment into consideration, which, as we know through any history class or anything that we've taken and learned throughout our lives, if you're just looking at one part of a problem, you're not going to find a solution. So I think it's reframing it as, you can believe whatever you want, and I'm not going to hate you for that. But let's take steps in the right direction before we can have that conversation. And additionally, let's have conversations that take into consideration the economy, because it affects you and it affects me.
Mm-hmm.
I think a more recent example is what we've seen with the coronavirus. This is a situation where, whether you agree with how the government has handled it or not, we can all say that the measures that were taken had a serious impact on people's jobs and their livelihoods, and a disproportionate impact on working class Americans. And so because of that, we can just use that as an example of what would happen if you decided to go with this all or nothing approach. Of if we were to say, okay, we're going to transition to an entirely solar and wind society tomorrow, then we would have massive societal upheaval. I think that people might be forgetting that at the beginning of this whole shutdown around the country, there was so much uncertainty that people were legitimately talking about whether or not we would be seeing real civil unrest across the country, and thank God we haven't seen that in any sort of large scale. But we can use examples that don't specifically have to do with the environment to be able to understand that society cannot function if we simply take all or nothing approaches. And when I always tell people, I was a lot chubbier, and I the day that I decided to start losing weight was, I just said, okay, I'm going to start with just 1 pound, and then 2, and then 3. You got to start somewhere and then get to your goal eventually. You can't just say, oh, well, I didn't lose 25 pounds in a day, I guess I'm done. Mm-hmm. Or the other option isn't, I'm going to go and take a knife and cut off 25 pounds off.
Right.
I'm not going to go and cut off an arm. And so we really need to look at it from what is best for everyone to get where we want to be, instead of how do we, miraculously become something that we can't in a day.
And as we're talking about, having to jump into something, without thinking it through, or not having enough steps, I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about energy. I think that's a good place to start. I'd be interested to hear, what's the greatest misconception you all have heard about oil and natural gas. For example, I know I've encountered quite a few from friends and acquaintances, and enjoy taking the time to sit through it and talk through it with them. I'd be interested to hear what misconceptions you guys have heard and how you've dealt with it.
I'll let you start, Matthew, so I'm not always taking all the talking points.
No. I love it. He's a lot smarter than I am, so I get to just sound smart after following up.
You're both.
One of the big things that I find really interesting is sort of the way that young people view oil companies and energy companies as somehow evil. I think that it has to do with the way that they're taught history. When people hear the name Rockefeller, they think the robber barons of the 1920s, and because they most likely read Howard Zinn in high school and didn't actually read a history book. And what they forget is that what Rockefeller, and he certainly did shady things, but what he did was he added 8 hours to the day. What he sold people was light. It was a light source that was cheap and abundant, and that people got to use to extend their lives. And so oil companies and energy companies and natural gas companies, all of they're not evil. They're providing people a service that they would otherwise not, that they would have radically, fundamentally different lives without it. And a lot of these companies, they want to exist 20 years from now. They want to exist 40 years from now. So they are investing heavily in the technologies to reduce carbon emissions, to help keep the world from falling apart. I would say that's just getting people to understand that simply applying ill motive to your opponents doesn't win you the argument is a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, the main misconception that I hear is that oil and gas companies are incredibly evil. And my first kind of showcase of that is that I originally thought that too, for a very long time. And because that's the norm. That's what people think at this stage in the game. And then, a year ago, you fast forward to a year ago, and I was speaking at the Alaska Oil and Gas Conference up in Anchorage, and I would tell people about it, and they'd be like, "Are you serious? Like, how can you do that if you care about the environment?" And so that sort of pushback is something that I was part of, and that I'm still living through. And I think we all are, who support the industry in different ways. And I think that the main misconception is that because oil and gas companies did certain things in the 70s or 80s or 90s means that that's how they are today. And there were mistakes made, as there are in every single job sector and energy sector and whatever. And there were bad people and there were good people. That's how it works. That's how life is. And today in 2020, you have most companies, including a company like BP and smaller companies and pretty much everyone in the industry, dedicating their livelihoods to finding ways to reduce emissions. And they're not just talking about it. It's not just greenwashing. They're actually doing things about it. They're investing billions of dollars in nonprofits and technologies that they can utilize to reduce emissions. That's happening because they want to succeed for the next 20 or 30 years, and they want to keep employing people, and they want to keep making money while also helping the environment, which should be a very okay and good thing, and uplifting people out of poverty and allowing developing countries to continue developing until they are developed. I mean, that's the future that we should all want. And so that misconception is really, really off but the other thing is that we have to understand why they feel that way, why people do feel that way. And I think that it has been a perception issue. It's been a poor messaging issue on a lot of the oil and gas community's part. It's been also the errors of some of the past that a lot of people feel like haven't been rectified. And so I think as people who support the oil and gas community and they're in the energy transition to cleaner energy, we also have to understand where people who are maybe anti-oil and gas industry are coming from if we ever hope to reach them into the future. It's not saying, oh, you hate the oil and gas industry? Well, your phone's made out of, minerals and stuff. Like, that's not going to help. But having a conversation saying, okay, I understand why you feel this way, but here's what the oil and gas community is doing to change that. I mean, I think that's the approach that we have to take, because a lot of the feelings are valid, but the reasoning and kind of the background in 2020 maybe isn't as valid. And that's what we have to start changing the dialogue on. The other thing is not necessarily misunderstanding, but it's a lack of understanding about how many opportunities there are for people to make a difference in the oil and gas space environmentally. If you want to make a difference in reducing emissions and helping the environment, there's no better place than to be in the oil and gas space, helping companies reduce emissions via technology and innovation. There are so many job opportunities. There are countless opportunities for young people to have their voice heard in a much more massive way than any nonprofit could ever do. And that's coming from a nonprofit leader. So there are so many amazing opportunities within the industry that people don't know about. It's like, if you care about the environment and you majored in environmental science or engineering or anything, there's no better place than the environmental sustainability side of the oil and gas industry. And that's something that people don't know and should know.
I think what people don't, I feel like maybe some of the misconceptions or misunderstanding also come from, they just don't know enough. So when I first entered the oil and gas world, that was when pipelines really first became a huge national issue, and it was all over the news with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so when I began talking to my friends about pipelines, they were like, pipelines are evil, they pose such an endangered environment, explode. And, taking the time to learn about pipelines really changes that perspective. I mean, you learn that pipelines are the safest and most efficient ways to transport oil and natural gas. They have something ridiculous like a 99.99% safety rating. Pipelines are also, when Benji, when you talk about a team of environmental, focused scientists and individuals, pipelines reclaim the land on top of them. So they have whole teams devoted to reseeding and replanting and healing that ground. So you would never even know there's a pipeline there. And that's one of the misconceptions that I feel like I get frustrated with.
That is such a good one, because that's one that is always in pop culture and is always talked about in the news. And I think it goes back to the point of no energy source is going to be perfect, and it's a matter of mitigating those effects. And so, yes, you do have to build a pipeline underground, and that means that you are going to have to temporarily damage that ecosystem. But you can do that in a way where you're rebuilding that ecosystem and making sure that the ecosystems around it are not affected. I mean, that sort of reality is the reality across all energy spectrums. So when people say, "Oh, well, there just shouldn't be oil and gas," that's the way to just not have to build the pipelines. It's like, well, how are you going to create your solar panel then? And how are you going to create the wind turbine? And so I think, and wind turbines take up space too. And it's just, these issues are way more complex than people think. And what sounds good environmentally isn't always good environmentally. Another good example is managing forests. It doesn't sound good to cut down trees or have controlled burns or take out dead brush and kind of harm the ecosystem. But it's necessary because as humans, we've planted trees too close together, and we've done things that have made our forests like little tinder boxes, and those can go up in flames at any time unless we take action. And so taking action doesn't sound pro-environment, but it actually is. And it's the same thing with a pipeline, that I think just a lot of people aren't able to draw that parallel. And again, we have to understand why. And a lot of that is because it doesn't sound good. But we have to convey why we understand where those people are coming from, but also the reality behind the situation, which is that these issues are not as simple as they come across.
But you can make a big impact if you're a company, that cares about the environment. And I think we've seen oil and gas companies work really hard on conservation efforts, not just when it comes to pipelines and reclaiming that land, but also in the areas that they're drilling and operating, because there are endangered species there, and they work with nonprofits. I'd be interested to hear from both of you, what are other examples of companies that you've seen that have had really interesting conservation efforts going on. Would love to hear some.
I don't know if I have a good answer to what companies have really good conservation efforts. What I would say is that a lot of these people who think that we need to move to a purely renewable energy supply, I think that a lot of them have never actually seen poverty. They've never seen what poverty looks like up close. I grew up in Hong Kong and traveled a lot in mainland China in the early 90s. And, it's sort of jarring from an American perspective to see a society that still had peasants at a time when poverty in the United States means obesity. Poverty in China at the time meant starvation. And the reason that I bring this up is that when you are in a subsistence form, when economic requirements force you to really take whatever means necessary to provide power, you don't care whether or not it's clean. You don't care where it comes from or whether or not you're able to have the comforts of modern life. You're simply focused on, I need this to work so that I can make enough money to get the food that I need and cook it. I'm concerned that a lot of the people that are really focused on purely renewables don't understand that if we did have a economic collapse due to a sudden shift, that the answer would be to return to dirtier and less efficient forms of energy instead of continuing forward towards the utopia that they seek.
Yeah, I mean, that's seen firsthand in Germany, right? I mean, they said we're not going to allow nuclear because nuclear is too dirty. And now they're building more coal plants because they couldn't rely on strictly wind and solar. And maybe that is a future that's out there. Maybe. We don't know, but it's not what the current reality is. To answer your question on the company side of things, I think it's been really cool to see the conservation work that Exxon has done with wetlands restoration, especially up in the Northeast, because wetlands and kind of that those are part of blue carbon. Natural carbon sinks to take out carbon out of the air, and making sure that we manage and recreate wetlands that humans have destroyed for whatever reason, and help keep them safe and healthy, I think is really important. And I love that they work on that. And then I also just think it's great to see a company like BP set its sights on carbon neutral by 2050 and be investing a large chunk of their budget every single year in doing that. I mean, I've had conversations with some of the folks at BP who have told me that that's everything they do 5 years ago was about figuring out how to keep creating profits, and that includes some environmental sustainability. Now, fast forward to 2020, every single decision they make is under the guideline of, will this help us get to 100% carbon neutral by 2050? And that is just an amazing initiative that has transcended down the entire company to people who have worked there for decades to their new president that has instituted that. And it's going to take more companies doing things like that. And I know a lot of the smaller companies have done that as well. And I know, Shell and like I said, Exxon are also really involved in that. And pretty much every company is at this point. But I just think that having something that blatantly obvious and that forward thinking is what it's going to take to A, reduce emissions to the level that we need to, B, create new technologies that help out the economy and create millions of jobs, as energy efficiency has already done in the United States, and C, keep the oil and gas space thriving for decades.
Benji, it's interesting that both you and Matthew talked about how energy, when we talk about energy mix and our energy policy domestically, it affects the world. When you talk about other countries that implemented policy and then ended up using dirtier energy, emissions don't stay within geopolitical boundaries. They go everywhere. And something in the oil and natural gas industry that we talk about a lot is our ability to export our products across the world, especially, natural gas. We're seeing this transition from coal to natural gas in developing countries. Like, I think we talk a lot about Asia and the potential to reduce emissions in Asia because they were really heavily on coal for their electric generation. And so transitioning natural gas would significantly emissions there. And, a few years ago, we weren't allowed to export our oil and gas products out to the world. What other examples have both of you seen where you think there's a chance to implement U.S. policy that betters the world for the environment?
Well, I mean, that is the question that we all need to be thinking about. I actually think that's the most important question out of anything environmentally, is that what we do in the United States will have no effect environmentally if we can't export those sorts of decisions to the rest of the globe. So you can want a Green New Deal, or you can want a carbon tax, or you can want whatever, but you're going to have to export whatever policy we do here to another country. And if that's not feasible, then it's not really worthwhile. And so the reality of the situation is that the United States, when we drill for oil or build a wind turbine or create a battery for an electric car or any of those things, power, whatever, we do it cleaner than anywhere else in the world because we have safeguards to keep our employees healthy and safe. And we have emission standards, and we have those things that keep our economy moving, but also really make sure that our environment's at the top priority. In the Middle East or in Asia and in other developing parts of the world, that is not even in a considerate part of their minds, because they are developing and they're trying to get things off the ground. And a lot of the times they have corrupt governments that are just basically exploiting resources for their own tyrannical power. And so as a country, we have an opportunity to export these technologies, carbon capture, just natural gas in general, nuclear power, and a bunch of different types of technologies to other parts of the world. And that's what it's going to take to get these developing nations to be able to power themselves. And a country like India and China and countries in Africa and other parts of Asia as well, they deserve to have improved ways of life. They deserve to keep growing their economies, and they deserve to eventually have a country that is as developed and as vibrant as the United States. They're not going to get there if we're trying to force things down their throats, but they will get there if we provide them technologies that help lower costs of energy production, and there's an added benefit of helping the environment. That's great. And so it's up to us to do that. And so I think the example is India and China are increasing their emissions dramatically, while the United States and the rest of the globe is staying fairly stagnant or going down. And we have to create the technologies here that China and India can use. And natural gas is a huge part of that equation. And instead of China building dozens and hundreds of new coal plants, we actually have China start implementing natural gas technologies across the country. That would be a huge win, and it would help decrease emissions on a massive scale. And so I think we need to reshift the conversation and try to get ahead of other countries in the fight for cool technologies and innovations so that we can make that a priority and decrease emissions going forward across the globe.
You know, there are a lot of people that whenever they hear the word profitability, they assume that it means that you're somehow evil. And I'm not entirely sure why. Anything that just because something is profitable doesn't mean that you are taking from someone else. And I think that that's one of the problems, is that people assume that you can't have mutually beneficial exchange, that any type of exchange is somehow exploiting someone else. Being able to export and profit from those exports allows us to, for example, if we can trade natural gas down in South America, where they already have a lot of natural gas, but a lot of their cars use compressed natural gas instead of oil for transportation. Compressed natural gas has its benefits. You can fill up a compressed natural gas tank almost instantly to like 50%, but to fill it to 100% takes like hours. So there are trade-offs. But when we're able to export our energy, we're able to export our ability to assist those who are geopolitically helpful to us. It is, being able to support Europe and not have them be at the mercy of Russia's energy policy, is an extremely important geopolitical goal for the United States. In order for us to maintain our good relationships with the Europeans. And one of the things that I've said before, and I haven't said it lately because Bezos might actually become a trillionaire before this happens. So I've often said that the first person to create a double-digit efficient, large-scale battery is going to be the world's first trillionaire. Bezos might beat that person now, but right now, I mean, a AA battery is really efficient for 1.5 volts, but it's not very efficient if you're trying to power a city. In order for us to be able to export renewables, we need to be able to develop batteries that can be transported. Right now, if we wanted to do something like that, we'd essentially create a ship that's one giant lithium-ion battery, and the problem with that is that you poke it with a sharp thing and it explodes. I mean, there are many engineering and technological issues that we need to overcome. And when in the past we've seen a lot of government look at things like, okay, making solar panels more efficient and whatnot, that's all great. But until we get to the point where we can export that energy, we can have the most efficient solar panel in the world. But unless we can export that energy, that doesn't help us globally.
So as we're approaching the end of our conversation, we're approaching time. I think it's hard for us to ignore that right now is a very difficult time for energy. Just like a lot of other industries across the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has severely affected, the business operations of oil and gas companies. There's dampened demand. And then, right before the pandemic, there was also some geopolitical conflict between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which resulted in a sudden drop in oil prices. What we've seen is some politicians celebrate the difficulties and job losses in the industry because they're opposed to oil and natural gas development. Instead of that celebration, what do you wish those politicians would do to address the turbulence in energy right now and keep in mind their environmental goals?
That attitude, as a Houstonian, I find it offensive. Those are my friends. It's my family. Those are the people that are drastically impacted by this, and it's also belies a total ignorance of the situation when a certain not to be named politician from New York was gloating that the price of oil had dropped negative. She just didn't understand what the issue was. It was a supply of available space to store. It was a storage issue, not a oil and gas is not valuable and not useful for society. I think that we need to hold our leaders accountable when they say things that are actively harming the people that they're supposed to protect. And just because you have good intentions doesn't mean that the words that you're saying or that the actions that you're taking are therefore morally right. I don't know. I don't want to go too far off and then say something that I shouldn't. So I'm going to turn it over to Benji.
Well, Benji, maybe my question for you is, as we're at this pivotal moment for the energy industry, what can be done? How can politicians engage with energy, and what can the energy industry do itself that as it rebuilds, it keeps in mind the environmental goals that, some individual companies have set for themselves, that, your organization hopes we achieve down.
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts, as cliche as it sounds, it starts with compassion. And it starts with people understanding that everything affects everyone. And just because one industry is struggling doesn't mean that you don't have to worry about it. Because if I'm using what Matt was talking about with like AOC, I mean, at the end of the day, even though her district isn't, an oil and gas district, the oil and gas industry has effects on her district, and the people in her district are at a bigger disadvantage because of the problems that are being faced by the oil and gas industry right now. And it's the same thing with coronavirus. I mean, we thought, oh, whatever happens in China doesn't matter. Well, it does. Things affect everyone. And there are hundreds of thousands of clean energy jobs that have been lost. And that's sad too. That's just as sad as the fact that the oil and gas industry is struggling, because that also affects everyone. And it holds us back from getting the goals that we have to have as a globe and as a country. So I think it's starting with compassion, understanding that. And for companies and elected officials and for nonprofits, I think it's looking at this with a more robust lens than just, clean energy bad, oil and gas good, or oil and gas bad, clean energy good. It's looking at this from a more productive perspective. And that perspective is, how can we move all energy sectors to a more sustainable place, not just economically and not just environmentally, but also for the longevity of these industries into the future? Because if we had better energy storage technology for wind and solar, we probably wouldn't have lost so many jobs. And so it's something, those sorts of improvements are not just good in the short term for the environment and the economy and creating jobs, but they're also good in the long term. And so I think we as a society often think so short term, like what is the president tweeting today, or what is X happening today? And those things do matter, but the longer term effects of economic implications and environmental implications also matter. And I think elected officials have to take a more robust look at it. There are people on the complete opposite of AOC who, in my opinion, are just as problematic on the opposite side of things. And we have to strike a better balance if we're going to go forward. And I know it sounds cliche, but you can do it on almost every issue. It doesn't mean that you're going to agree with people. It doesn't mean that you're going to always find common ground, because you won't. But it means that you're going to at least be able to move the ball forward in a productive direction, which we haven't been able to do. And in all honesty, although there are opposites to AOC in the world, I have not seen people laughing off the $600,000 or 600,000 jobs lost in the clean energy space. People are laughing off the oil and gas industry, and that's not fair, because those are human lives. Those are human people who are relying on those jobs for their livelihoods, just like you and me. And they are just like you in so many other ways. And of course, it affects you far past the humanity aspect of trying to have respect and compassion. It affects the way that you power your home. It affects the way that you get products every day. So I just think it's just a matter of looking at things from a much, much more wide-eyed perspective than closing your eyes to the realities of the situation. And I think after we get through this crisis, at least start to get through it. And I think that we're nearing the point where we can start, obviously taking this crisis into consideration. But as we're trying to think of other things other than just COVID, we have to think of how we move the oil and gas industry back into the sustainability space as it gets back off the ground, because that is going to keep the oil and gas industry around for decades to come. And I would urge elected officials and allies of the oil and gas community to think about that as they're making decisions.
And as a representative within, sort of within the GOP, let me just reiterate something that Benji, I think that you were being really good at pointing out, but you're also being a bit diplomatic about it. There are people in the GOP that need to take this seriously, that need to take environmental policy seriously. That for so long they have just rolled their eyes and laughed because, frankly, the proposals that have been put forward to them have been laughable. But if those leaders don't take it seriously and they don't act like it's a serious issue, then their voters won't act like it's a serious issue. And we will continue to have only one side giving proposals. And it's one of the reasons why I think that the work that Benji is doing is so important, is because he's bringing a conservative perspective in a space where the only perspectives so far have been progressive perspectives. And so, I'm perfectly fine, slapping my party upside the head and saying, get your act together.
And I swear I didn't pay him for that.
No, I feel like those are very genuine words.
Well,
as we're closing out, I think one of the takeaways I've had from this conversation is that you can care about the environment, you can be passionate about energy, and you can be passionate about the energy mix, right? It all comes together. So on a more lighthearted note, because I know we kind of got into some heavy stuff near the end, since we all care about the environment, I would love if you all shared your favorite spot, to get out in nature and get out. Matthew, I think our supporters are interested to hear where in Texas you like to get out in nature.
I'm a Houstonian, so and I'm like an inner loop Houstonian. So when I say get out in nature, it's like I walked through Rice Village.
Did you go to the Bayou? The Bayou is a lovely park. It has.
Sure. I still wouldn't call that nature, but no. I mean, I honestly, I'm a big snowboarder, so I love going out to Colorado and just hitting the slopes. And I think that there are a lot of conservatives are sort of fundamentally conservationists. There are a lot of hunters. There are a lot of fishermen, and I think that I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I've lived in cities my entire life. So I'm gonna pass that off to Benji.
Yeah, well, my favorite place, Colorado is amazing. One of my favorite places that people would know of is North Cascades National Park, which is in the northern part of Washington near the Canadian border. Just amazing. It's like the Alps, but in Washington. Please don't come because it'll get more touristy, but it's beautiful and it's solely mine. But my favorite place that people wouldn't know, and my favorite place overall, is Minocqua, Wisconsin, which is where I grew up, going to the lake on this tiny little cabin and going fishing and swimming. And it's pretty peaceful up there. And you just realize how much of an impact we have on nature. And it's really great to be out in nature because it helps you realize how important it is. And Minocqua, Wisconsin, which I wish you the best of luck if you try to spell that, is one of the greatest places.
I'm just going to say it. I'll, for me, I grew up in Utah, so equally a big state full of national parks. I really loved going to the Wasatch Mountains growing up, spending time in all the different hiking trails in the mountains over there. Thank you.
Lucky place to grow up in.
It is. I was really, really lucky. And you know what? I think now that I live in Houston, there's still plenty of outdoors. I just have to drive a little bit farther. There's some nice beaches at Galveston. Some nice wet.
I wouldn't call Galveston a nice beach. I'd say that there is a beach at Galveston. That is certainly true. My family's from Puerto Rico, so like when I see the beach at Galveston, I get offended.
Okay, well then I'll say there are some lovely national parks in Texas.
There are.
I'm planning to go to Big Bend at some point soon, and so thank you. What I'm trying to say is thank you both for joining me today. It's obvious that we all care about the environment. We all care about addressing climate change, and we care about doing it with practical solutions, with solutions that generally lead us in step in a direction, and that can embrace a variety of energy sources, including natural gas.
Completely agree. Thanks so much for having us, and I'm really excited to keep working with you guys into the future.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you both.